Former Staff Sergeant Marcus Reed had been working as a commercial construction foreman in Portland, Oregon, for 11 months since leaving the Army after 14 years of service. At 36 years old, Marcus hadn't retired from special operations or elite combat units. He'd served as a military police officer with multiple deployments, handling law enforcement duties, detainee operations, and force protection responsibilities. He left military service not from physical injury, but from psychological exhaustion and self-awareness. Watching military veterans transition into civilian law enforcement only to face increased complaints about excessive force, recognizing his own PTSD symptoms manifesting as hypervigilance and aggressive responses to perceived threats, and making the difficult choice to step away before he became another statistic in studies showing veterans were more likely to use force in policing situations. Veterans transitioning from military and law enforcement roles commonly struggled with translating skills into civilian terms and finding meaningful work that utilized their capabilities. Military police skills transferred well to construction management roles requiring leadership, discipline, problem-solving abilities, and experience working under pressure. Now Marcus managed construction crews, maintained deliberate distance from law enforcement work, and tried to convince himself that the nightmares and constant threat assessment were just adjustment issues that would fade with time, rather than permanent conditions requiring ongoing management. PTSD symptoms in veterans commonly included hypervigilance, difficulty sleeping, severe anxiety, and detachment from others. Marcus exhibited all documented symptoms despite avoiding formal PTSD diagnosis during his military service. His companion was Sarge, a 6-year-old German Shepherd who'd served as Marcus's military working dog during 2 deployments, specializing in patrol and detection operations, typical of military police K9 teams. When Marcus left military service voluntarily, Sarge retired with him under the Military Working Dog Adoption Program. German Shepherds were renowned for their intelligence, loyalty, strong work ethic, protective nature, and ability to maintain operational capabilities despite aging and retirement from active service. The German Shepherd maintained constant operational awareness that never diminished, scanning environments for threats with tactical precision, positioning himself protectively near Marcus in public spaces, exhibiting the disciplined vigilance that civilians found intimidating, but Marcus understood as training that doesn't deactivate just because deployment ended. On a cold October evening at 21:45 hours, when Portland temperatures dropped and rain threatened, Marcus was walking Sarge through Portland's waterfront park after finishing a late construction project, meeting with subcontractors. It was a routine they'd maintained since moving to Portland. Late-night walks that gave Sarge necessary exercise and Marcus temporary escape from the cognitive dissonance of choosing comfortable construction work over law enforcement service he was extensively trained for but knew he couldn't handle safely given his PTSD symptoms and hypervigilance. As they passed near the Salmon Street Springs fountain area where tourists gathered during daytime but which was largely deserted at night, Marcus heard sounds that triggered immediate threat assessment. A female voice giving authoritative police commands, a dog yelping in acute pain, a younger male voice shouting entitled threats laced with rage, and the unmistakable sounds of physical violence in progress. Marcus's military police training activated despite his deliberate 11-month distance from law enforcement contexts. He moved toward the disturbance with Sarge at controlled heel position, both veteran and K9 transitioning seamlessly from routine walk to operational readiness. 40 yards past the fountain, near a dimly lit pathway where park lighting was inadequate, Marcus saw a scene that crystallized every reason he'd left military service. A uniformed Portland Police Bureau officer, female, approximately late 20s, was being knocked to the ground and systematically kicked by a male approximately 6 feet tall, 175 pounds, wearing expensive streetwear brands and designer sneakers that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Beside the officer was her K9 partner, a Belgian Malinois in tactical vest, whimpering and limping from apparent injuries sustained attempting to protect its handler before being repeatedly struck and kicked by the attacker with deliberate viciousness. The male attacker, later identified as Trevor Ashford, age 22, was delivering systematic kicks and strikes to the downed officer's torso and head while shouting threats that revealed his entire mindset. "My family has money. You think you can arrest me? My dad will sue you, your department, this whole city. I know the mayor personally. You're nobody. Touch me again, and my family's lawyers will end you. Do you understand what that means?" The officer was attempting to defend herself, but she was clearly injured, appeared disoriented from head trauma sustained early in the assault, and unable to effectively access her service weapon or radio while being continuously assaulted. Marcus's military police assessment was immediate and comprehensive. This was felony assault on a law enforcement officer in progress. The K9 had been deliberately injured to prevent defensive intervention, and the attacker's statements explicitly referenced wealth and political connections, suggesting he genuinely believed money provided immunity from consequences. This wasn't random violence or a confrontation that escalated accidentally. This was someone whose family's resources had convinced him he was fundamentally above accountability, attacking a cop who'd probably tried to enforce laws he believed didn't apply to people of his social class. Marcus faced a decision that every study about veteran transitions warned about explicitly. Veterans were statistically more likely to intervene physically in confrontations, more likely to use force in law enforcement scenarios, more likely to face complaints about excessive response compared to non-veteran officers. Marcus had left military police service specifically to avoid becoming another statistic, another veteran whose combat training and PTSD symptoms made him dangerous in civilian policing contexts where split-second force decisions were required daily. Every rational calculation said, call 911, be a good witness, don't intervene physically, because that's exactly the kind of aggressive veteran response that gets you arrested, sued, or portrayed as unstable. Studies on military to civilian transitions emphasized that veterans needed to translate their skills appropriately and recognize that military responses might not be suitable for civilian contexts. But Marcus also knew from 2 deployments worth of military police operations that calling and waiting meant the officer could be beaten to death or permanently disabled in the 90 seconds it takes to complete a 911 call and explain the situation to a dispatcher. Sometimes the rational choice that minimizes personal risk conflicts with the moral choice that saves lives. Sometimes studies about excessive force by veterans miss the fundamental point. It's not about being quick to violence. It's about being trained to stop violence effectively when ordinary civilians freeze or make ineffective interventions. Marcus gave Sarge the operational command from their deployment days. Guard. It was the specific command they'd used when civilians were being threatened and military police needed to establish control without immediately resorting to force. Sarge understood immediately. Protect the vulnerable person, contain the threat, await escalation of force authorization. The German Shepherd moved with disciplined precision, positioned himself between the attacker and the downed officer, issued a deep warning bark that communicated Iria's capability, exhibited the controlled aggression posture that clearly communicated boundaries without attacking. Trevor Ashford made a critical tactical error. He kicked aggressively towards Sarge, attempting to strike the dog like he'd done to the officer's Belgian Malinois K9. That aggressive movement toward the protective dog provided legal justification for intervention. That's when Marcus intervened, not with excessive force, but with the minimum necessary control, using techniques perfected through years of military police training. Moved behind Trevor during his off-balance kick, applied a standing rear control position that immobilized the younger man's arms, using leverage, guided him to the ground, using body mechanics rather than strikes, maintained dominant ground position that prevented further violence without causing injury. The entire engagement, from Sarge's initial protective positioning to Trevor's complete immobilization, lasted exactly 11 seconds. Marcus maintained control while calling to the officer. Portland Police, I'm former Army MP. Your K9 is injured, but mobile. Can you call for backup? The officer, later identified as Officer Sarah Novak, 29, 7-year veteran with the K9 unit, was bleeding from facial lacerations, clearly concussed, but functional enough to activate her radio with trembling hands. 10:33. Officer needs assistance. Waterfront Park fountain area. Suspect in custody. Civilian military veteran intervened. Portland Police responded within 3 minutes. Multiple patrol units, K9 supervisor, and a sergeant who recognized the situation's complexity the moment he saw Marcus maintaining professional control of a cursing, threatening suspect, while Sarge maintained protective positioning near the injured officer and her K9 partner. The sergeant, a 20-year veteran named Williams, who'd seen countless situations involving civilian interventions, assessed the scene carefully and made a statement that reflected the complicated reality of veteran interventions. You intervened to help Officer Novak. That's commendable and probably saved her life. But you also physically engaged a civilian using military police techniques. That's legally complex, especially if this kid's family has resources for litigation. You did the right thing morally. That doesn't always protect you legally, especially given current scrutiny of veterans in law enforcement contexts. Trevor Ashford regained his composure remarkably quickly and immediately began his defense narrative with practiced ease, suggesting this wasn't his first encounter with law enforcement. That guy attacked me. His dog threatened me. I was just walking peacefully through the park when that cop harassed me for absolutely no reason, and this man assaulted me with military force. My father's law firm will destroy you all. I want that military dog seized immediately. I want this man arrested for assault and excessive force. I'm the victim here. The story was already forming with disturbing familiarity. Wealthy young man portrayed as innocent victim. Veteran portrayed as unstable aggressor using excessive force. unlimited legal resources deployed to make the narrative stick in court and public perception. Marcus was processed at the scene with standard procedures. Comprehensive statement to responding officers documenting exactly what he witnessed and his specific actions. Photographs carefully documenting the assault evidence, including injuries to Officer Novak and her Belgian Malinois K9. Witness contact information exchanged with Officer Novak and multiple responding units. Sergeant Williams pulled Marcus aside for a direct, honest conversation once they had privacy away from Trevor Ashford. "What you did was absolutely right from a moral standpoint. Any cop in this department would have done the same if they'd been here. But Trevor Ashford's father is Richard Ashford, founding partner at one of the largest law firms in Portland, serves on multiple city and state boards, has political connections throughout Oregon. Trevor's been arrested 3 times before: DUI, drug possession, disorderly conduct, and walked every single time because Daddy's lawyers and political influence make charges disappear. You just physically engaged his son using military police techniques. His attorneys will argue you used excessive military force, that you're unstable from PTSD, that veterans like you shouldn't be intervening in civilian situations. Unless we have absolutely clear evidence, this becomes complicated very quickly." Officer Novak, being treated by paramedics for facial lacerations, concussion symptoms, and bruised ribs, provided crucial information that became the case's foundation. "My body camera was recording the entire time. The entire assault, his threats about his father and political connections, him attacking my K9 repeatedly. Everything is documented with audio." The body camera footage became critical evidence, showing unambiguously that Trevor initiated unprovoked violence, and Marcus intervened with controlled, minimal force, exactly what military police training emphasized for civilian law enforcement contexts. Marcus was released from the scene with explicit warnings from Sergeant Williams about potential legal retaliation from the Ashford family, and advice to document everything, vary his routines, and prepare for aggressive litigation. Within 48 hours, the predicted escalation occurred with disturbing precision. Trevor Ashford was arraigned on felony charges, including assault on a law enforcement officer, but released immediately on bail posted by his family. The Ashford family's law firm, with substantial resources and political connections, filed aggressive countercharges against Marcus for assault, battery, and use of excessive force by a military veteran with known PTSD issues and documented hypervigilance. They filed dangerous dog complaints against Sarge with Multnomah County Animal Services, demanding immediate seizure under Oregon's dangerous dog statutes, claiming the German Shepherd threatened Trevor unprovoked. Local media ran coordinated stories questioning whether veterans with combat experience should intervene in civilian situations, given statistics showing veterans generated more excessive force complaints in policing contexts compared to non-veteran officers. The coverage was clearly designed to establish narrative that Marcus represented dangerous veteran stereotypes rather than appropriate intervention. Officer Novak and the Portland Police K9 unit provided critical institutional support. Novak's body camera footage was released through official police department channels, showing unambiguously that Marcus intervened with controlled, minimal force to stop a brutal assault in progress. The K9 unit supervisor submitted official documentation that Sarge's actions were disciplined protective positioning without attack, superior restraint compared to typical civilian dog responses, and consistent with military working dog training standards. The crisis arrived when Marcus received a visit at his apartment from two attorneys who identified themselves professionally as representatives of the Ashford family interests. They weren't intimidating thugs, they were polished, expensive attorneys whose message was delivered with legal precision. Mr. Ashford Sr. recognizes this situation is regrettable and wants to resolve it efficiently, the lead attorney explained in measured, professional tones. He's prepared to offer $150,000 settlement in exchange for dropping all cooperation with prosecution against Trevor, signing a comprehensive NDA preventing discussion of the incident publicly or with media, surrendering your dog voluntarily given the dangerous dog complaints and public safety concerns, and relocating outside Oregon within 6 months. Mr. Ashford wants to avoid prolonged litigation that could surface. Uncomfortable details about your military service, your documented PTSD diagnosis with the VA, and peer-reviewed studies showing veterans with your background are statistically more likely to use excessive force in civilian policing contexts. It was sophisticated intimidation wrapped in settlement language. Substantial money to disappear, sacrifice his canine partner, let a wealthy kid face 0 consequences for felony assault on a police officer, and implicitly accept the narrative that Marcus was a dangerous, unstable veteran whose intervention was excessive rather than heroic. The offer included an implicit threat delivered with legal precision. Fight this, and they'll weaponize every academic study about veteran force issues, every PTSD symptom Marcus had documented with the VA seeking treatment, every hypervigilant response pattern that made him leave military police work to avoid daily force decisions. For someone who left military police service specifically to avoid becoming a statistic about veterans and violence in civilian law enforcement, this was the test of whether his career choice meant avoiding accountability or finding it in a different context that still allowed appropriate intervention when necessary. Marcus's response shocked the Ashford attorneys with its directness and clarity. Tell Mr. Ashford that his son committed felony assault on a law enforcement officer, which I personally witnessed. I intervened using minimal necessary force consistent with my military police training, a standing rear control and ground containment that caused 0 injuries to the suspect. I'm not signing an NDA that protects a criminal from consequences. I'm not surrendering my dog who executed perfect protective positioning without attacking. I'm not relocating my life and career because someone's father has money and political connections. And I'm fully cooperating with prosecution. If Mr. Ashford wants to weaponize academic studies about veterans and force, I'll provide expert testimony about the critical difference between excessive force in daily policing contexts and controlled intervention in a single emergency. I left military police service because I didn't trust myself to make force decisions safely in daily policing situations. Turns out, I trusted my self-assessment correctly. I used exactly the force required in this specific emergency, nothing more. That's not PTSD making me violent or unstable. That's training making me competent and self-awareness making me responsible. The attorneys left, making clear through body language and carefully chosen words that Marcus just rejected the reasonable option and should expect consequences. The Ashford family escalated aggressively across multiple fronts. They leveraged extensive media connections to run coordinated stories portraying Trevor as victim of violent veteran with PTSD and hypervigilance issues. They pressured Marcus's construction employer to terminate his foreman contract, citing liability concerns. They used political connections to pressure Portland police leadership to minimize Officer Novak's public support of Marcus. They funded sophisticated social media campaigns questioning whether veterans should be allowed to intervene in civilian situations, given statistics about veteran force issues in policing. Officer Novak and veteran organizations mobilized immediate resistance. Novak provided extensive media interviews describing the assault in detail and explaining Marcus used minimal necessary force that likely saved her life. Veteran advocacy groups recognized the case as weaponizing PTSD stigma against someone who intervened appropriately. Police unions supported Marcus, noting that civilian bystanders rarely have the training to intervene safely. Veterans with military police backgrounds are exactly who should intervene in emergencies. The turning point came when Marcus testified at a pre-trial evidentiary hearing. The Ashford attorneys attempted to introduce peer-reviewed academic studies showing veterans were statistically more likely to use force, more likely to face excessive force complaints, more likely to engage physically in confrontations. Marcus's response, delivered calmly under oath with remarkable clarity, became widely quoted in media coverage and veteran transition programs. Those studies measure veterans who became police officers and faced situations daily where force decisions had to be made repeatedly over years of service. I'm not a police officer. I deliberately chose not to become one because I recognized my PTSD symptoms, and hypervigilance made me unsuitable for daily policing contexts. I intervened once in a single emergency situation where a cop was being beaten to death and her K9 injured. I used a rear control position and ground containment, textbook minimal force that caused 0 injuries to the suspect. Yes, I have PTSD. Yes, I have hypervigilance. Yes, I left military police work because I didn't trust myself to make force decisions safely in daily policing contexts where split-second judgments are required constantly. But this wasn't daily policing. This was a single emergency where someone needed help, and I had the specific training to provide it without excessive force. The studies you're citing actually support my decision and validate my self-awareness. I recognized I couldn't handle routine policing safely given my symptoms, so I chose a different career in construction. But recognizing my limitations for daily policing doesn't mean I abandoned my responsibility to help in genuine emergencies where controlled intervention saves lives. That's not dangerous veteran behavior. That's self-aware veteran responsibility. Public opinion shifted dramatically as the body camera footage circulated widely across social media and news outlets. What the Ashfords framed as dangerous veteran attacks civilian was revealed as trained military police veteran stops wealthy kid from beating cop to death using minimal controlled force. State prosecutors refused to drop charges against Trevor despite intense political pressure. Media investigations revealed Trevor's documented history of avoided consequences and his family's pattern of using wealth to prevent accountability. Trevor Ashford's trial proceeded despite his family's extensive legal maneuvering and attempts to delay proceedings. The body camera footage proved devastating as primary evidence, crystal clear documentation of sustained felony assault, explicit threats referencing his father's wealth and political influence, deliberate repeated attacks on a police K9 to prevent intervention, and zero evidence supporting his claim of defending himself against police harassment. Trevor's high-powered defense attorneys argued their client was intoxicated and therefore not fully responsible for his actions, an argument that spectacularly backfired when prosecutors demonstrated this was his fourth alcohol-related violent incident with zero consequences because his family systematically prevented accountability through legal and political pressure. The prosecution presented comprehensive testimony from Officer Novak describing the unprovoked assault, expert testimony from use of force specialists explaining that Marcus's intervention used minimal necessary force, and testimony from the K9 unit supervisor documenting that both Sarge and the injured Belgian Malinois behaved appropriately under the circumstances. The jury deliberated for 5 hours and convicted Trevor Ashford on multiple felony charges, including assault on a law enforcement officer, aggravated battery, animal cruelty for attacking the K9, and making terroristic threats. The judge, noting Trevor's documented history and his family's pattern of using wealth to avoid accountability, sentenced him to 7 years in state prison with strict conditions, one of the stiffest sentences for assault on a law enforcement officer in recent Oregon history. The judge's sentencing statement became widely quoted in media coverage. The defendant intervened to stop a felony assault in progress. His military police training enabled him to do what most civilians couldn't: stop violence without escalating it. This is not a case of excessive veteran force or PTSD-driven violence. This is a case of appropriate veteran intervention, where training, self-awareness, and controlled response saved a law enforcement officer's life. All charges against Mr. Reed are dismissed with prejudice. Marcus faced no criminal consequences whatsoever. The Ashford family's aggressive civil lawsuits seeking damages were dismissed by judges who noted pointedly in their rulings that Oregon law explicitly protects individuals who intervene to prevent felonies, and that the lawsuits represented an abuse of the legal system attempting to punish someone for protecting a police officer. Richard Ashford spent an estimated $3 million in legal fees across criminal defense, civil litigation, and political lobbying, achieving nothing except proving that unlimited resources cannot overcome clear video evidence and proper force application. The financial costs extended beyond legal fees. Multiple city board positions were not renewed after public pressure. The law firm faced client departures concerned about association with the case. The family's reputation for using wealth to protect their son was publicly destroyed. Officer Novak fully recovered from her injuries after 3 months of medical treatment and physical therapy, returning to full duty with the K9 unit. Her Belgian Malinois partner made a complete recovery after veterinary treatment for bruised ribs, soft tissue injuries, and psychological trauma from the attack. She publicly advocated for state legislation protecting civilians who intervene to assist law enforcement officers under assault, citing Marcus's intervention as the model for appropriate civilian response. She credited Marcus with saving her life and her K9 partner's life, testimony that became central to the legislative effort. Marcus and Novak developed a genuine friendship built on shared understanding. Both knew that sometimes doing what's right costs more than doing what's easy, and that training matters most when stakes are highest. 8 months after the intervention, Marcus received an unexpected offer from a veteran-owned security training company. Develop and teach a comprehensive curriculum on appropriate civilian intervention and use of force for veterans transitioning out of military police and law enforcement roles. The position acknowledged what Marcus proved, that leaving military police work because you recognize PTSD risks doesn't mean abandoning your capability to help when help is genuinely needed in emergencies. The curriculum would address the critical distinction between daily policing force decisions that veterans with PTSD should avoid and appropriate emergency intervention that saves lives. 1 year after that October evening, Marcus and Sarge participated in a major veteran law enforcement training conference in Seattle, demonstrating controlled intervention techniques for military police veterans transitioning to civilian careers. During his presentation to an audience of law enforcement professionals, military transition specialists, and veteran advocates, Marcus addressed the question everyone debated. Studies show veterans like you are more likely to use force and face complaints in policing contexts. Why should anyone believe your intervention was appropriate and not just another example of veteran excessive force? Marcus's answer became foundational text for veteran transition programs and law enforcement training nationwide. Those studies are accurate and important. Veterans in daily policing roles do face more excessive force complaints compared to non-veteran officers. But those studies measure people making hundreds of force decisions annually in routine policing over years of service. I made one decision in a single emergency using training that let me stop violence without escalating it. I left military police specifically because I didn't trust myself to make those decisions safely every day, given my PTSD and hypervigilance. But recognizing you can't handle routine policing safely is fundamentally different from abandoning your responsibility to help in genuine emergencies where someone's life depends on controlled intervention. The study's critics cite actually validate my career choice. I knew my limitations, chose a career that respects them, but retained the capability to help when someone's life depended on exactly the training I possessed. That's not dangerous veteran behavior. That's self-aware veteran responsibility. We need to stop conflating daily policing force issues with emergency intervention. They require different decision-making frameworks. Veterans who recognize they can't handle daily policing due to PTSD shouldn't be made to feel they must also avoid helping in genuine emergencies where their training saves lives. The presentation included detailed demonstrations using Sarge of how military working dogs could provide protective positioning without attacking, how controlled force could stop violence without causing injury, and how self-aware veterans could intervene appropriately in emergencies while avoiding situations requiring daily force decisions. 18 months after the intervention, Marcus expanded his work to include consultation with construction companies seeking to better support veteran employees transitioning from military and law enforcement backgrounds. He helped develop programs recognizing that veterans brought valuable skills to construction management while needing support for PTSD symptoms and appropriate applications of their capabilities. He also began mentoring transitioning military police veterans, helping them understand that choosing careers outside law enforcement didn't mean abandoning their training or responsibilities, just applying them appropriately in contexts that respected their limitations while honoring their capabilities. I spent 11 months feeling like I'd abandoned my training by choosing construction over law enforcement, Marcus told groups of transitioning veterans. Then I intervened once, used my training appropriately in an emergency, and realized I hadn't abandoned anything. I just found the right balance. You can recognize that PTSD makes you unsuitable for daily policing, while still being exactly what's needed in genuine emergencies. That's not contradiction, that's self-awareness. The construction industry values veteran skills like leadership, discipline, and problem-solving. You don't lose those by choosing construction over law enforcement. You just apply them differently. And when genuine emergencies happen, your training still matters. You just need wisdom to know the difference between daily policing you can't handle and emergencies where you're exactly what's needed. 2 years after that October night in Waterfront Park, Marcus received recognition from the Congressional Medal of Honor Society for civilian valor, acknowledging extraordinary courage by civilians who risk their lives to save others. During the ceremony, attended by law enforcement officials, military leaders, and veteran advocates, Oregon passed the Novak-Reed law protecting civilians who intervene to assist law enforcement officers under assault, with provisions specifically addressing veterans with appropriate training. The wealthy kid who attacked a cop and her K9 learned that his family's money and political connections couldn't protect him when a military police veteran refused to walk past injustice, and when video evidence made wealth-based defenses irrelevant. Marcus Reed discovered that leaving military police service didn't mean abandoning the principles or skills that made him effective. It just meant finding the right application where his capabilities saved lives without requiring the daily force decisions his PTSD made unsafe, where protecting the vulnerable required trusting his training in genuine emergencies while respecting his limitations for routine policing, and where sometimes the most responsible veterans are those who know their limitations well enough to work around them through appropriate career choices, while still being willing to help when someone's being beaten, and the training that makes you a risk in daily policing situations makes you exactly what's needed when chaos requires someone who can stop violence without becoming violent, who can intervene without escalating, and who understands that self-awareness about PTSD limitations doesn't mean abandoning every situation requiring controlled force, just choosing which situations you engage and ensuring that when you do, your training saves lives rather than creating the excessive force complaints that studies warn about for veterans who don't have the wisdom to distinguish between routine policing they should avoid and genuine emergencies where their training is literally the difference between someone living or dying.